plan to post it to YouTube, assuming the technology provides a quality recording. Now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Suzanne Dorsey. In June, she was appointed as the Maryland Department of Environment's Deputy Secretary and also as chair of the Maryland Commission on Climate Change.
Thanks, Amy. I want to just take a moment. There are 165 and increasing participants. I want to give a moment to recognize any elected officials or incoming elected officials. If you could take yourself off mute and just introduce yourself.
I'm Nina Forsyth. I'm Commissioner of Water, Parks and Rec, a city council position for the city of Frostburg.
Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Hello, this is David Jenkins. I'm a La Plata Town Council member from La Plata, Maryland. Thank you.
Thank you. So I just want to first welcome everyone here this morning on behalf of Secretary Horacio Tablada, the Secretary of the Maryland Department of the Environment. We really appreciate you taking the time. I just have a brief couple of words here. I want to emphasize that climate change brings with it a keen sense of urgency, and that urgency is shared by the commissioners and also by the skilled staff in all of your state agencies as we work to problem solve and develop a set of tools to ensure that Maryland is at the forefront of addressing climate change and being ready for climate change. I also want to emphasize that along with the risk and the sense of urgency that climate change poses to us as a society, it also poses an incredible opportunity. And the opportunity is really to imagine a different future and then build that future. So the Maryland Commission on Climate Change is a diverse community of problem solvers. They represent a variety of different sectors, from the business, the utilities, environmental sectors, and many more, as well as academicians and state agencies. We all tend to be heads down problem solvers. So a lot of what you're going to hear about today is practical. It's recommendations that will move Maryland forward to address the urgencies and the risks of climate change. We've had many successes. Some of those successes have come about because of past activities. I would suggest that the Chesapeake Bay program, our Chesapeake Bay Restoration Program, is our state's largest investment in adaptation and resilience to a changing climate. I would also suggest that the Conservation Finance Act, passed in 2022, will provide additional financing tools to help us implement green and blue infrastructure. And I really want to congratulate this year's commission for being collaborative problem solvers in an era where collaboration can be very difficult. So what's left? There's an awful lot left, but the commission really focused this year on prioritizing those recommendations that needed to be done now. There's a lot of work that needs to be done now in order for us to meet our ambitious climate goals, as well as prepare our communities to meet the challenges that they're facing today and the challenges that are coming. We need to connect the dot between the solutions that we're providing and the leaders, those in business owners or those rural, urban, and suburban residents and property owners, those local government leaders, some of whom announced themselves today, who are struggling with issues today, whether it's heat islands, flooding, septic failures. Throughout our states, the communities on the front line of climate challenges are often our most vulnerable communities. So we need to imagine a better future. We need to imagine a future that is equitable, that is safer, greener, bluer, healthier. It's decarbonized, and it's thriving with circular economies. This commission has set forth a series of recommendations to get us to that imagined future. Practical solutions, carefully considered using the expertise from around the globe and in our great nation. It has been an honor to be the chair of this commission. I thank all of the commissioners for their attention, their time, their talent, and in particular, their expertise. I challenge all of you Marylanders to think carefully about the future that we want to build and ensure that it is not only climate resilience and climate adapted, but that it is also equitable, healthier, bluer, greener, and thriving. Thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to the rest of this webinar. Thanks, Amy. Amy, you're on mute.
Thanks. Thank you, Dr. Dorsey. We will have a series of speakers today. Charmaine Brown, Dr. Peter Goodwin, Christine Kahn, Michael Powell, myself, Delegate Dana Stein, and Chris Hoagland. And we will be going through an agenda that covers the recommendations that were included in the Commission's 2022 annual report. I'd like to introduce to you Charmaine Brown, who will be talking with us about climate justice.
Thank you, Amy. And thank you, Dr. Dorsey. We can advance the slide, Amy. And thank you all for joining us today and for the opportunity to share with you how the climate justice team approached its work of applying the equity lens and embedding equity into the recommendations that you'll hear about today. Key to the work of the climate justice team is valuing, respecting, and appreciating the lived experiences of communities that continue to be overburdened by the devastating impacts of climate change. Communities whose voices often are suppressed and where the poor pay more. We begin our work with those communities in mind. We end our work with those communities in mind. And the questions that you see on this slide today are the questions that we ask as we are keenly focused on the problems that we are solving for and relying on the experts that you will hear from today and the experts that represented the climate justice team as liaison to each of the working groups. We explored a number of things as we did our work this year. And on this slide, I only want to point out a couple of these. So as we considered the recommendations and the issues that Marylanders face, we asked ourselves, who will benefit from the recommendations? Who might be harmed by the recommendations? What is missing? Who needs to be a part of the conversation in terms of stakeholders and stakeholder involvement? I also want to recognize that we explored things that are important to the competency of the people doing the work. Diversity, equity, and inclusion education, such as unconscious bias. We know that while unconscious bias may be an uncomfortable topic, bias left unmitigated has consequences. So we would discuss those important issues in terms of education. We also looked at tools that can help us to be smarter about data and where we're targeting solutions, such as the EJ Screen tool. We engaged stakeholders, such as the Maryland Green Bank, in our speaker series to understand how those burdened by energy consumption with limited income are being impacted by climate change. We have a lot more work to do, we recognize that. But I do want to thank the experts, as I mentioned before, who were part of the work this year and the climate justice team. So in addition to Dr. Dorsey, we have Dr. Ava Richardson, who is Director of the City of Baltimore Department of Planning Office of Sustainability, and Dr. Richardson represented climate justice on the mitigation work group. We have Brandy Espinola, Climate Resilience and Sustainability Program Manager, University of Maryland Environmental Finance Center, who was on the Adaptation and Resilience Work Group with liaison to climate justice. Tristan Sill, Resiliency Education Coordinator, Chesapeake and Coastal Service, Department of Natural Resources on ECHO, Education and Community Outreach. Dr. Alan Anderson, who is an Associate Professor of Chemistry at my alma mater, Bowie State University, on Science and Tech. Dorothy Morrison, who is a Sustainability Strategist and Principal of AYOD Consulting. And finally, the person who kept this team together, Kim Pisa, Climate Change Policy Analyst, Maryland Department of Environment. I want to thank you again for the opportunity to be a part of this important conversation, and I look forward to your questions. I will now turn it over to Dr. Peter Goodwin. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Charmaine, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for participating. If we could go to the next slide. I thought it would be worth just very briefly us highlighting the role that the Science and Technical Work Group does. First of all, we're asked to track the state of the science around climate and also track any emerging innovations that can assist in Maryland achieving her climate goals. We also provide science support, not just through the members of the Science and Technical Working Group, but where necessary, we reach out for expertise in the private sector and across all of our institutions. We also play a role as the scientists are heavily involved in many of the state's programs, finding synergies. And as you're probably aware, secretaries are very keen to show win-win-win. So when actions for the recovery of Chesapeake Bay have also assistance in mitigation or adaptation to climate change, of course, there's multiple benefits. And also we play a role in helping promote Maryland's leadership in climate innovation and climate justice across the US and beyond. This is through conferences, scientific meetings, and advice to other government entities. Next slide, please. So as part of our role of tracking the current science, I'm sure most of you are aware that the IPCC is in the process of finalizing its 6th assessment report. Over the last 2 years, there's been multiple working group reports released, and we expect the synthesis report to be due any day now, which will summarize all of the findings. And what's important in this series of documents is that in the past, there would be a % of uncertainty in many of the conclusions. In this version of the report, it now uses wording such as it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land, and widespread and rapid changes have occurred in our environment. And also, there is no doubt that this continued global warming is projected to intensify the global water cycle. In the comments I'm making here today, you'll find most of the key references in the Commission's annual report. There's further details in the meeting records throughout the year of the STWG. If we can go to the next slide. So briefly, in summary, As the world went into COVID in 2020, we saw a 6% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. Unfortunately, the following year, we saw almost a complete rebound to the pre-2020 levels in greenhouse gas emissions. And what this tells us is that if we stay on this trajectory of observed emissions, we can expect a temperature increase somewhere between 2.7 and 3 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. I'm sure most of you are aware that the science community has said that if we cross the 1.5 degree C threshold by the end of the century, we really run the risk of being into uncontrolled consequences of climate change. And so this 1.5 degrees Celsius is critical. However, the reports also document that the time for action is now. It's not too late. And that's why you'll often see referred to in the literature, this has to be the decade of action. So the legislation that was passed in Maryland this year certainly puts Maryland on track to meeting our responsibilities. Next slide, please. And so what can we expect in Maryland as a result of climate change? Extreme precipitation is likely to increase in frequency and intensity over the next couple of decades. For flooding, we can see increases in the frequency of flooding by very intense rainfall, flooding from rivers, flooding from exceptional high tides, the so-called clear weather day flooding, and of course, storm surge flooding as a result of increased storms. We're also going to be experiencing increased heat waves with particular consequences to our inner city communities. And in the States since 1980, NOAA has been tracking the frequency of billion-dollar disasters. And in Maryland, as you'll see in the annual report, there's the graphic there showing this exponential increase in these billion-dollar disasters which Maryland is exceeding and experiencing. We're also going to be seeing accelerated increase in sea level rise. And of course, continued degradation of air quality as a result of both heat waves and other atmospheric changes. So with that very brief overview of the state of science, perhaps we can go to the next slide, which is the recommendations of STWG. First of all, we recommend a review of the state agency capacity. In just the last 2 or 3 years, as a result of a multiple of factors, including the Climate Solutions Now Act and its complementary legislation, changes in the federal side, there's been a huge increase in workload and the diversity of workload on the staff of our agencies. And we want to be clear, Maryland is very fortunate to have some absolutely outstanding staff within our agencies. So this isn't a criticism of the capability we have right now. The fact is the workload has just exploded. We're also recommending a climate change response accelerator to do 2 things. The first is that when the state agencies that are tasked with the greenhouse gas reduction update to the state agencies that are tasked with adaptation to saltwater intrusion and other adaptation measures, there needs to be a mechanism to very rapidly bring on board experts from across our universities, the private sector, and the NGOs. Secondly, there's some transformative research beginning to come to fruition through the research universities in this state that will not only help Maryland achieve its goals, but could also have global significance. And we're recommending that this climate change response accelerator could bring those technologies to the forefront and to practical application much sooner. And then there's a series of recommendations regarding the current knowledge gaps. we strongly recommend that the state builds in-house capacity for the modeling and assessment capacity in Maryland. This will help agencies, it will assist the governor and the General Assembly in tracking our progress and making the right policy and management actions to guide us towards net zero. Secondly, Maryland is a leader in the ocean acidification plan of states. This links very well with our recovery of Chesapeake Bay activities, and our ability to make a contribution to reduce the rates of acidification of the oceans is also critically important. The third here is to enhance our air quality monitoring. The state already does a job that's better than many of our sister states. But in particular, we think the measurement of point sources of methane should be improved. And also to look at these air quality monitors to ensure that the models which we build around these are as accurate as possible, particularly in highlighting hotspots around our vulnerable and at-risk communities. You'll also see 3 recommendations in there about early warning for public health adaptation to threats of climate change. We regard this as extremely important for the health and well-being of Marylanders. And finally, under this changing hydrology, the changing weather that we're seeing, we need to update our methodology for designing stormwater and flood design. This has enormous cost, both in the implementation of the protective infrastructure and reducing the potential damages and disruption to businesses in Maryland. In putting these recommendations together, I would like to acknowledge Alan Anderson, who's been our liaison with Charmaine Brown's group. And Charmaine, we've really appreciated your leadership and guidance. And here, those asterisks to note the major changes we made in our recommendations to ensure that the recommendations is really serving all Marylanders. So with that very brief introduction, I will finish there. And Amy, perhaps you would like to pass to the next speaker.
I'll be happy to jump right in there. Thank you, Dr. Goodwin. I'm Christine Kahn. I'm representing the Adaptation and Resilience Working Group today on behalf of the chair, Secretary Jeannie Hadaway-Riccio, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. Just in general terms, our work group really strives to enhance the resilience of natural and human-based systems across multiple sectors. So we're looking at bay and aquatic environments, agriculture, human health, water resources, population growth, critical infrastructure, forest and terrestrial ecosystems in our coastal zone. And we work with the science that you've just heard Dr. Goodwin give an overview on, and with the priorities from the Climate Justice Group, and integrate these into comprehensive strategies to help reduce Maryland's climate change vulnerability. We serve as a resource to state and local governments for tools and planning resources, and we provide a platform for collaborative.
Christine, you got on mute again. Christine, somehow, there
Oh,
you
I'm
go.
sorry, was I on mute the whole, my apologies.
Not the whole time. You just switched off.
Oh, yeah, okay, I'm sorry, I must have had a keyboard failure. Amy, could you advance the slide for me, please? Our recommendation presented in the annual report is to develop our next 10-year roadmap to resilience. And I'll go over in a few minutes some of the history we've had in adaptation planning. The key here is that we need to kind of review, revise, and move forward and set new priorities for the next 10 years, really look at tracking and setting agency-specific deliverables, looking at how to be very transparent and accountable by developing an online tracking system. And we're going to get this done within a year. Next slide, Amy. We've had a long history of adaptation planning in the state. We started doing adaptation planning in 2008 with our phase 1 strategy, which focused on sea level rise and coastal storms. Then we moved on to expand that effort in 2011 to include increased temperature and changes in precipitation. We've included adaptation elements within the greenhouse gas reduction plans as well. So in 2015 and the 2021 GGRA plans, adaptation has been a key factor. And then we can look at our 2019 watershed implementation plan for restoring the bay. Adaptation, again, has a very significant role in helping us restore the bay because of climate change impacts on temperature and sea level and precipitation, which definitely have impacts to the bay. Next slide. So in 2018, we took a look at where we were with our various efforts of adaptation planning. We looked at our progress. We saw that it was some great successes in certain areas, mixed in other areas. We realized that some of our key players weren't really deeply engaged in our adaptation strategies. So we proposed to the commission, and the commission directed us to develop a new framework for guiding and prioritizing action over the next 10 years. And this is how we embarked upon our new 10-year plan, our roadmap to resilience. Next slide, Amy. So the adaptation framework was a facilitated process facilitated by the University of Virginia Institute for Engagement and Negotiation. And the process was divided into, we invited a number of participants to work with us. We developed 5 sector groups, which you can see in the bubbles over on the left part of the screen. And then also 3 focus areas to include environmental justice and equity. We wanted to also look at how we can develop new economies, building jobs and funding to support jobs in that adaptation and resilience sector. And we also focused on local government capacity and how state services could be more effectively delivered to support the efforts that happen on the ground in local governments who are really facing a lot of these immediate impacts. Next slide. So just to give you a flavor of what some of these strategies are looking like, in diversity and inclusion, we're looking, one of the key strategy area was to improve decision-making processes for funding programs so we can prioritize investments in underserved and overburdened communities. From the local government perspective, to have the work group develop a web-based toolkit of capacity building tools and resources and grant opportunities and training and so on to help our local partners get the access to the science and the resources that they need to really prepare for climate change. And then climate jobs and training. There could be a tremendous amount of job loss resulting from direct climate impacts. And there could also be a number of jobs and training needs that arise from that. So that's another key area. So that's just a flavor of some of the strategies that our framework process developed. Next slide. Another factor that we really want to push forward here, and Dr. Dorsey had mentioned this in her introduction, is that from many of these strategies are based on the services provided by nature. And these strategies really are a win-win. We want to be able to focus as we move forward, how we can align these resilient strategies with mitigation efforts, also with bay restoration, and that these are co-benefits to achieving resiliency. And many of these natural-based strategies are going to generate all of these benefits. So if they're working together, we can be more effective. Next slide. And we have great opportunity to accelerate progress. So the future is very bright. The Maryland Trees Commission plan, authorized by the 2021 Tree Solutions Now Act, is moving forward a goal to plant 5 million trees by 2030. and laying the foundation for what will truly be an effective and new opportunity through carbon markets to finance some of these projects. Through the 2022 Conservation Finance Act, we're advancing investments in blue and green infrastructure as well. So we're looking at new models of financing, such as pay for success procurement, public-private partnerships, and other innovations. So this is all really good news for moving this work forward. Next slide. So these are our next steps. There is a link on this page to the draft Maryland Climate and Adaptation Resilience Framework. So this is the product of that effort to develop a framework. We engaged 70 participants from 30 different organizations in this work. We have over 300 activities listed in this draft framework. We worked with and reviewed this with a number of stakeholders. Over 70 stakeholders were involved in looking and reacting to this framework. So now that we have this framework, our next step is that we need to go through all of these activities. We've made tremendous progress on a number of them. So we need to look at that progress. We need to look at what the needs and the most important priorities are to move forward. Because it's really a lot of excellent work ahead of us, and we need to look at metrics, how we measure our success. We are looking for participation from organizations, groups, the public, to help us in a variety of ways, and there is a link on this page to fill out a survey form if you're interested, or you can contact me directly. Okay, next slide. And that concludes my presentation, and I'd like to hand it off to Mr. Michael Powell from the Mitigation Working Group.
Mike, you're on mute. Mike, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I was just commenting that the typo in the title that I just noticed, which shows how complex and difficult this work can be. Let me talk a little bit about the Mitigation Working Group before I get into our specific recommendations. Maryland adopted the most aggressive climate act in the country. Our goals for 2031, our proposals, are going to be exceeding that or equal to, but I think in many cases exceeding that of any other state. The Mitigation Working Group's job is to try to develop a plan to reach the goals that the General Assembly has set. And I think uniquely and I think importantly, we have a working group that's intended to be balanced, that has interests from a wide variety of interests. I co-chair the group. I'm a representative of business. My co-chair is Kim Coble, who's from the League of Conservation Voters and obviously represents the nonprofit environmentalist sector. And it follows through with the group. And I think that has allowed us to try to develop a set of recommendations that, though they have to meet this very aggressive standard, attempt to take into account all the varied interests. Next slide. Okay, we went through huge numbers of submissions and draft recommendations. We met for at least 2 hours. The full mitigation work group met for at least 2 hours every month. We had subgroups meeting as well. We had individuals meeting with other individuals to try to go through recommendations and decide which were the ones that were most important. We're very conscious of the fact that if you did too much, if you tried to put too much on the page, then everything gets lost in the mix. You can't see the trees because you're too busy seeing the forest. But nevertheless, when we got down to the end of the year, we had 12 pages of single-spaced recommendations that we had to go through. And we had over 6 hours worth of meetings just in the last month just to go through that list. We boiled it down into five categories. These 5 categories we think are the most important things which the state has to do in order to meet the very aggressive targets. Doesn't mean there are not other things to do. One of the things we're going to do over the coming year is go through the other recommendations or draft proposals in those 12 pages, plus anything else that people want to propose, and go through those and see if there's anything else we should be adding to our playbook. But these 5 we thought were the most important. And within the 5, the first 2 are, in the opinions of the mitigation work group, far more important than the others. And I'll explain why. But those 2 we think are the most important. Not that those 2 alone solve the problem, but the most important for us to address. The transportation, simply because it is the largest source of greenhouse gases by far. The greenhouse gases from transportation are nearly twice that from all the power plants in Maryland and the power plants that we import power from outside of Maryland. Add up every power plant in the state, and it's just slightly more than half of what our transportation produces. It's 3 times, almost 3 times, the amount of greenhouse gases that come from buildings, direct emissions. So if you don't deal with transportation, you might as well fold your tent and go home. It is the big gorilla in the room that we have to deal with. Clean power generation, when you look at a lot of our proposals, and I'll go through some of these, dealing with both transportation and buildings, basically across the board, the common thread is we want to move things off of the burning of fossil fuel onto electric sources. So you want to take cars off of burning gasoline, make them electric vehicles. You want to take buildings off of gas boilers and put them on heat pumps. But how much benefit you get from all of the rest of the program depends upon where that electricity is coming from. And it is clear that Maryland is not building solar power projects and wind power projects on a fast enough pace in order to meet the standards that we need to meet. Somehow we have to increase that. And a lot of this comes down to utility scale solar. We can put solar panels on roofs, and we should put solar panels on roofs. We should put solar panels above parking lots. We should put solar panels above brownfield sites and above landfills. But if we don't get the big, huge solar farms, then we can't replace those big, huge natural gas power plants. And currently, Maryland has only built 7 utility scale solar farms in the state. So a big issue there is how do we speed up that pace? I'll come back to building decarbonization, methane capture, thermal energy. These were all issues that we began to address last year, particularly building decarbonization, but we think we need to go further. So next slide. On transportation, I'm going to flip the first 2 here to explain them. The Advanced Clean Cars 2, which is the second item here, we had recommended be adopted by the end of 2022. Advanced Clean Cars is also known as California Cars. That's a very aggressive program. It would require something like 35% of all cars sold in the state be zero emission vehicles, electric vehicles, or plug-in hybrids by 2026. That 68% of them be electric vehicles by 2030, and that would forbid the sale of all light duty, that's cars or light pickup trucks, burning gasoline by 2035. So you would not be allowed to buy a gasoline powered car after that year. We're not going to get that adopted by 2022. We understand that Department of the Environment feels they need more time to do that. I am absolutely confident that will be adopted early in 2023. Of all the recommendations that the mitigation working group has made, this is the one I am most certain will occur because it's already a requirement of existing law. We are required to copy California's California car standards. I'm very confident General Assembly will not repeal that, so that will be adopted sometime in 2023, I feel certain. But we felt that even those numbers, as aggressive as they are not going to be sufficient. So our first recommendation is we adopt a target, an aspirational goal of getting 75% by 2030 rather than the 68% required by Clean Cars. You're not going to get there without a lot more incentives. One of the problems with the Climate Solutions Now Act, as aggressive as it was and as progressive as it was, is there wasn't a lot of funding for the proposals there. And the only way I think to get people to move faster with zero emission vehicles is with incentives, because currently the zero emission vehicles are much more expensive to purchase up front than gasoline powered car. You clearly save money over long run, right? There's no oil changes, there's no transmission fluid, there's no transmission, there's no fan belts, brakes last longer. But the upfront cost can be as much as $40,000 more than a comparable vehicle. So we want that aspirational target, and we're recommending that there be methods adopted to try to encourage that. One of those is the third bullet here, which is we recommend that a green bank provide low interest loans designed to lower the monthly cost of zero emission vehicle ownership to assure that it's cheaper on a monthly basis than owning a gasoline powered car. Maintenance is already cheaper, but if you're making car payments on a car that costs $40,000 more than a gasoline powered car, then your monthly cost outlay may not be as good. Advanced clean truck rule. The earlier comments were all about light duty. It's much more complicated with heavy duty vehicles, right? Semi trucks, turning them to electric is a more complex issue. But there is an advanced clean truck rule being proposed. 9 states are currently planning to implement this rule. We recommend that we join that clean truck rule, but it's going to require incentives. These semi trucks can cost $200,000. They're designed to last a long time. Many of them are owned by owner operators, guys who are basically single person businesses. It's going to be hard to get them to turn in their $200,000 truck and buy a more expensive electric truck, unless again we offer incentives. Low carbon fuel standard. This is really some way to bridge the gaps. Until we can get enough zero emission vehicles on the road, we're going to have to deal with the gasoline powered vehicles. A low carbon fuel standard, which is something Oregon, for example, has been working on, would allow us to help bridge that gap. And when I say gap, it could be a lengthy gap. Even if the average car sold stays on the road for 12 years. So even if we achieve 100% new electric vehicles by 2035, as you can imagine, there's going to be a huge number of legacy gasoline powered vehicles on the road for a long time because of that 12 years. So we need a low carbon fuel standard. Last point under transportation, EV charging equipment at multi-dwelling buildings. Look, I have an electric car, but I've got in a garage and I've got a driveway. It's fairly cheap for me to put a charger in there. But you can imagine a 5 or 6 story apartment building in East Baltimore. How do they manage to raise the money to put in enough charging equipment for all the people who are in that building? And we talked to a lot of multi-dwelling building owners, and they said, look, if you tell me that I've got to put in all that additional very expensive equipment and run in a very expensive equipment, it probably doesn't make sense for me to maintain the building anymore. So we think we need to do something to assist people in multi-dwelling buildings to get charging equipment they're going to need as this transition. It's the chicken or egg problem we've got, right? Nobody wants to buy an electric car unless they got a place to charge it. Nobody wants to put in the expensive cost of putting charging equipment unless there's somebody with an electric car. With that one, we're trying to jumpstart this issue. Next slide. Alternative transportation, we're not neglecting that. We clearly have to go to electric vehicles, but we also need to look at things like buses, rails. It's not neglecting that at all. It's just that as we talked to the Department of Transportation, they pointed out how difficult it is to get people out of their cars. You would have thought that at least the COVID and the rise of remote working would have made a huge significant difference. It's not as made nearly as much as you would think. People are just using their cars and driving somewhere else. And in some ways, it makes the problem of mass transit worse. When people were just traveling to and from work, you can put in a bus line and say, okay, this connects the suburb or this park and ride to this location. But when they're using their cars to go to the local Target and then stopping at the drugstore, it becomes more difficult. But we're nevertheless proposing that a higher percentage of the federal funds that go into transportation go into these non-vehicle sources: transit, bike and pedestrian infrastructure, transit-oriented development, as opposed to highways. We're going to have to find some way to make switches there. We propose major changes to the Maryland Commuter Choice Program. That's an effort to try to get businesses to participate in a program encouraging their employees to ride the bus rather than drive in. Again, this is an area where it's all in flux right now because of COVID, but the participation of that program is woefully low, about 50 employees. We want to get it at least up to 500. Again, funds to augment rail and bus mass transit and microtransit services, right? How to get people to take a lift to the rail station as opposed to driving a number of individual cars. Anything we can do to reduce the vehicle miles driven. Recertification of transit-oriented development areas. Let's take another look at where we have development that would benefit and would from mass transit and rails, and I think we need to re-examine some of the assumptions in that area. Next slide. This is, as I said, one of the biggest recommendations, the most important recommendations we have. What we saw is there are some issues that were slowing us down we can't do anything about. There were questions of panel availability when they're being made in China, where they're having all these COVID issues and tariff issues. There were problems with PJM, the regional approval authority, moving fast enough. But again and again, we saw that what was slowing down solar power development was local opposition. You'd have a developer come in, have a big solar farm project, spend large sums of money to acquire a site, to develop a site, to get all of the studies done to show that the site would work, and then there'd be local opposition. And to us, that was flipping it the wrong way. If you want to do this fast, we ought to have sites identified where people are encouraging solar farms rather than just wait until somebody spends a lot of money and then fight about whether they pick the right spot or not. And so one recommendation is we suggest that counties should go out and find themselves adequate sites for solar energy and then market those as, here's a great site for solar energy, come to this site, we'll do everything we can to help you build there. You're seeing some of that now with landfills, but there's just not enough landfill space to do what we need to do. We need some kind of affirmative effort of counties to encourage solar rather than simply sit there as a gatekeeper at the end of the day and say, yes, we like your plan, or no, we don't like your plan. And more often it's a, we probably don't. And then there's a back and forth about whether it would approve or not. Similarly, community solar programs is something that has been successful in this state. A community solar program is a smaller solar farm that's generally dedicated to supplying power to a particular community. The excess power I need that's not supplied by the panels on my roof come from a local community solar program. But this program in particular is known for providing power, renewable power at good rates to moderate and low income families. We think that that pilot program, which as it exists now, should be made permanent, and that we should look at the financing to make it easier for lower and middle income customers to get power from these community solars. We think you got to increase the incentives for solar. Not that people were not building solar anyway, and the new federal acts certainly provided incentive, but the need for speed here cannot be underestimated. For us to meet those 2031 goal lines, we need a lot of solar very fast. And we're worried that what we've got now do not meet that. Then there's a list of about, and you can get it on the commission website in our final report, a lengthy list of additional proposals, net metering, long-term contracts, standard offer service using renewable power that we think we need to adopt in order to increase the speed of adoption. The other big button down there about the empowerment program, the Empower program, which those who are not familiar with it, primarily benefits low and moderate income families, and it's always been focused on efficiency, trying to find ways to reduce the cost of service to low and moderate income families by increasing the efficiency. We're suggesting that there be more look at the equitable benefits of shifting that and preserving greenhouse gas reductions rather than simply energy efficiency. And I'll come back to that. Next slide. Last year, and in the Climate Solutions Now Act, there was a lot of attention paid to building direct emissions. Unlike transportation, which had just some pieces in there, there was a lot on building decarbonization, and the Department of the Environment has a lot of regulation development going on right now about building energy performance standards. But we do think there are some loose ends that would need to be addressed. Again, the Empower program I just mentioned, we should be focusing Empower on reducing greenhouse gases. So, for example, if somebody has a natural gas powered water heater, rather than just saying we'll give you money to put in a more efficient gas powered water heater, we should look at putting in electric water heater. Similarly, for heating of the house, instead of putting a more efficient gas furnace in, let's put that money into putting in replacing the gas system with a heat pump. In some cases, this may be more expensive. Think about if you've got to put venting entirely through a house, but we think the incentives should be there. Again, electric new construction, we're moving toward requiring all new buildings to have heat pumps. But again, for certain kinds of buildings, it may be difficult to economically carry through with that. In the Climate Solutions Now Act, a task force was established in order to look at providing incentives for buildings to be all electric. The task force hasn't met, and there's no recommendation on that coming out of last year. We really think that needs to be carefully examined. Then we have a series of recommendations on the Public Service Commission role. We're suggesting that the Public Service Commission, which has primarily been focused historically on keeping the cost of electricity low, seems to need to also be looking at greenhouse gas reduction goals. So, for example, the gas line extension policy. Historically, the PSC would review an extension of a natural gas line to determine whether it would be economic to do it. Will there be enough new customers to justify and pay back the cost of extending the line? But obviously, increasing the number of natural gas customers in the state is counterproductive when compared to the goals that we've got to move toward heat pumps. Zero emission standards for space and water heating. We're suggesting the Department of the Environment adopt standards about what kinds of heat pumps and heat pump water heating equipment should be adopted and become standard in the state. There is a lot of new work being done on heat pumps and heat pumps able to operate in colder climates. There are some issues about cost if you go to pure heat pump as opposed to heat pump with a fossil fuel backup. There are big differences in what the impact is to rates, but those are some of the issues we need to work with. Next slide. I'll try to go through these last quickly because I think I'm running over my time limit. Methane is a far more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. And we've got two very large sources of methane in this state. That is methane from landfills and methane from cement plants. With the cement plants, they are making a lot of progress themselves. And by the way, when we looked at manufacturing across the board, except for the cement plant, there's relatively little, percentage-wise, there's relatively little greenhouse gases coming from industry in the state. We just don't have a lot of industry left. We don't have a Bethlehem Steel. We don't have a General Motors. But the cement manufacturing does produce a lot of CO2 and greenhouse gases. So we are recommending that there be a task force there to look at things like carbon capture and the substitution of hydrogen for some of the other sources of manufacturing materials. It's a long-term problem there. The cement industry is looking at it. We think we need to help them to move things along further. Methane from landfills and wastewater treatment plants. It's a big, significant source in this state. Dr. Goodson mentioned that we have discovered that our measuring of that methane has not been very well done. What occurred is we started sending airplanes up and measuring it on a statewide basis and discovering there's more methane than what we thought there was based upon the monitoring at ground level. But the counties say that they don't have the money to try to capture all that methane from landfills and wastewater treatment plants. So we're proposing that there be additional incentives offered to the government, matching funds, to assist them in doing recovery. Next slide. Got the next slide? Okay. This one's complicated, but we realize that there is a role to be played in the use of things like forest byproducts, leftover wood, building pallets, a whole series of things that currently might go to a landfill and decompose and create methane, but might be able to be burned and used for heating and therefore be a form of renewable energy. This was a very controversial and complicated issue. We formed a subgroup that spent a lot of time working on this, and it's a long, detailed explanation. I'd refer you to the website to read all of it, but we proposed a method of accounting for what is a renewable thermal energy and when can that be counted as a renewable energy source, including things like forest product developments and also incentives to encourage appropriate forest management so we get an appropriate carbon sink out of that. Next slide. Now, before I turn it back to Amy, let me just mention the mitigation worker group is going to continue to meet monthly. Our meetings are advertised on the website. At every single meeting, we reserve time for the public to speak, to give us new suggestions we haven't considered, to give us feedback on the things we're discussing, to tell us that we're all wet and we're stupid, whatever you want to do. We encourage that participation, and so we would certainly welcome your involvement as we tackle new issues in the new year. Amy.
Thanks, Mike. Before I get started, I've seen a few hands raised, and I just want to remind everyone that to keep your microphones muted and your cameras off, and to use the Q&A feature, which is built into Google Meet. You can access that through the button in the lower right-hand corner. It looks like a few geometric symbols. We will be answering questions at the conclusion of the webinar. So for the Education, Communication, and Outreach Working Group, or ECO, we're focused on public engagement strategies to inform Marylanders about the Commission's work in addressing climate change's impacts on our state, and to educate and engage Maryland's diverse constituencies around climate action. ECO included 2 recommendations in the 2022 annual report. The first recommendation to the General Assembly is on the use of plain short, and non-scientific language in legislation titles, in goals, in the names of future commissions, task force, and working groups. The second recommendation is requesting funding for planning and implementation of a statewide multimedia climate change awareness campaign. This will include development of an interactive website that will offer Marylanders information about how to access and utilize resources available to them to engage in climate solutions. All Marylanders need to be engaged and invested in achieving the state's goals of reducing GHG emissions and improving resilience if we're going to meet our goals. Both of these recommendations are focused on awareness, engagement, and understanding. And now I'd like to turn this over to Delegate Dana Stein and Chris Hoagland, who will be talking about next steps to reach those goals.
Thank you, Amy. And my name is Delegate Dana Stein. I am one of the two legislative members of the Climate Change Commission, the other being Chairman Paul Pinsky from the Senate. And before I talk about next steps, I want to be sure to thank commission members, work group members, and staff from a variety of agencies, and especially the Department of the Environment, for all the work that they have done this year among the subgroups, pulling together the recommendations and presenting this report. I know it represents a huge amount of work and collaborative effort. Now, in terms of next steps, I'll start and then hand things over to Chris. The Climate Solutions Now Act, which of course we passed the 2022 session, it was an omnibus bill. It requires a substantial amount of agency follow-up, especially by MDE. Mike Powell referenced the work, how the legislation, part of it focuses on buildings, on building energy performance standards for large existing buildings. And so MDE is tasked with coming up with developing those standards. Also, their acronym is BEPS, by mid-year of 2023. And as part of that, MDE's hosted 12 or maybe more listening sessions for different segments of the building industry. And I know just the one listening session that I sat in on, there were probably at least 40 representatives there for interested parties. And so that reflects the fact there's substantial interest in development of these standards. Another group that MDE be working on is the Building Energy Transition Implementation Task Force, which is a mouthful, but it's being established to make recommendations for programs and incentives to reduce emissions from the building sector through retrofitting and electrification. And those recommendations are due by December 1st of 2023. Now, another agency, there are several agencies that have implementing roles but under the bill, but another one is the Building Codes Administration within the state's Department of Labor. It is to develop recommendations for an all-electric code for new buildings, also due by December 1st, 2023. Now, in addition to those work groups that I mentioned, the legislation also tasks the Climate Change Commission with setting up 4 new work groups. And I'll just mention them quickly. If anyone has any questions about what their scope is, maybe we can deal with them in Q&A. There's the Just Transition, Employment, and Retraining work group. There's the Energy Industry Revitalization work group. There's the Energy Resilience and Efficiency work group. And lastly, the Solar Photovoltaic Systems Recovery, Reuse, and Recycling work group. So a lot of new work groups that the legislature mandated through the Climate Solutions Now Act be established to look at different issues. Now, I thought I'd also spend a few minutes just talking about possible legislative interest in the recommendations that are in this year's report of the Climate Change Commission. And I want to say the legislature pays a lot of attention to the annual reports issued by the commission. For example, in coming up with the building provisions in this past year's Climate Solutions Now Act, we look closely at the Commission's building energy transition recommendations and use, in some cases, a lot of the language that was in those recommendations. So we take very seriously the work that the Commission does. So I thought I'd speak to those recommendations in this year's report where I know there's legislative interest. First are the recommendations regarding acceleration of the transition to zero emissions vehicles. Mike Powell talked, how emissions from the transportation sector, very significant, need to be reduced quickly. And, specifically, I know that the legislature and my chairman, Kamur Barve, has sent a letter urging quick adoption of the Clean Cars rule that California has adopted. And also, I know that legislation to implement the Clean Truck rule will be introduced in the upcoming session. One of the recommendations that Mike also talked about was about providing funding to help EV purchasers who live in multifamily buildings install charging equipment, or legislation that would facilitate that either through likely through subsidies to the owners of those buildings. And I do know there's very likely to be legislation related to that recommendation in this coming session. Another one of the mitigation recommendations is to make the community solar program permanent, and there is very likely to be legislation that would do just that. Recommendation 15, Mike also talked about this, to increase equitable benefits through Empower and the State Housing Department energy programs. And so there was a bill last year, House Bill 108, that Delegate Charkoudian had introduced and was passed. It would have required energy conservation goals for DHCD programs. It was vetoed, and so I know that Delegate Charkoudian has already pre-filed that bill for next session. So those are the recommendations from this year's report where I know, or where it's very likely there'll be legislation. There could very well be others. And at this point, I'd like to hand things over to Chris Hoagland.
Thank you, Delegate Stein. So now I'll talk just a little bit briefly, since we're short on time, about sort of the next steps on the state agency side. So there are sort of two parallel streams of work that are going on. One is a planning process. As we've heard from others, the Climate Solutions Now Act this year that set the most ambitious targets in any state law also kicked off a series of planning processes that is going to take another year or so to finish. But then there's also the immediate actions, right? The planning process is extremely important, and MDE is diving into that. But we also want to be very clear that we don't want to wait for that planning process to take a number of actions that we already know we need to take. So as a parallel process, we also have, MDE has a suite of regulations that we're rolling out for more immediate action. So for those immediate actions, Mike Powell described a number of them at MDE, right? We're the pollution regulators, and greenhouse gases are air pollution. So our primary role in the state's climate approach is regulating greenhouse gases, reducing greenhouse gas pollution. And so, as Mike described, we have a couple of zero emission vehicle regs on the table that were recommended for clean cars and clean trucks. Like Mike, I am very confident that we'll be moving on those very quickly. And then we are in the process of two big greenhouse gas regulatory efforts. The first is our methane regulation for landfills. That regulation is complete. The proposal is pending publication in the Maryland Register. When we adopt that, we will be the third state in the country to be regulating methane from landfills. That's a big high impact action that we're taking. And then there's the building energy performance standards that Mike mentioned, that Delegate Stein mentioned. We've just completed an intensive stakeholder outreach process for that. And we're hard at work getting the regulatory text in shape for review. And the Climate Solutions Now Act requires us to adopt that next year. And then in the recommendations, there were a number of other sort of newer regulatory efforts that we're going to get to work on, sort of more development work of describing, designing such a regulation, seeing how it would work. Things like the thermal energy program Mike mentioned. This could be a clean heat standard is what other states have called the programs that they're working on in that area. So we're going to get to work on that. Also, a low carbon fuel standard was one of the recommendations. So we'll work on designing that. And then also a zero emission standard for appliances, like Mike described. These are things that are new policy areas for the state. So we're going to do a lot of sort of design work up front to consider how those would work. And we're going to work closely with the commission and the mitigation working group specifically on those, as well as the new task forces that Delegate Stein mentioned. And so those are sort of just a taste of some of the immediate actions that the state is working on to build out our approach to greenhouse gas mitigation. I mentioned the planning process. So the Climate Solutions Now Act set these new goals, and then it tasks MDE with developing a plan to hit those goals. We owe a draft of the plan by June, and we owe the final plan by the end of next year. We're working with the University of Maryland scientists at the Center for Global Sustainability to do all the number crunching for that, and we'll be working that very closely through the Commission's mitigation working group as we figure out what are sort of policy pathways to achieve the new goals: 60% reduction by 2031 and net zero statewide by 2045. To determine sort of what are the physical pathways to get there, and then how do we translate that into state actions, state policy actions, state investments, et cetera. And so that'll be a process over the entire course of next year. But we don't want to wait for that, like I said before, to take actions that we know already before we've done that planning process that we need to take. And a huge part of the work next year in implementing these recommendations will be taking advantage of all the federal funding that is now available through a series of federal laws that I'm sure everyone has seen, right? There was an infrastructure bill, there's the Inflation Reduction Act. Before that, there was the American Rescue Plan, which also included some relevant funding. There are now dozens of federal programs that are providing money either directly to, households and consumers who want to, say, electrify their heating system or buy an electric car. But also other programs that provide funding to the state that state agencies will then spend on mitigation activities. So that federal funding is a huge opportunity for us to accelerate our progress on climate change, and so that'll be a really big part of implementing these. As some of those federal programs, the federal agencies administering them get to the point where they're saying, okay, it's open for applications. The state has a lot of work to prepare to take advantage of all of that funding. So that's just sort of a taste of what we're doing to implement on the state agency side. I want to reserve time for Q&A. We've covered a lot of information. We received a lot of good questions. I will be your Q&A moderator. Again, I'm Chris Hogan. I'm with the Department of the Environment. I'm the Air Director. I provide staff support to Deputy Secretary Dorsey, who chairs the commission. So please keep your questions coming in the Q&A box. That's how we'll field it. And I ask the presenters who we've heard from to come back up on camera and be prepared for me to assign you some questions. We've received some good questions. Do keep them coming. I'll start maybe with some logistics ones. Some questioners have asked for the slides, the recording, noted that we're not going to have time to get through all the questions. That's correct. Amy, please correct me if I'm wrong. We expect the recording of this webinar and the slides to be posted on the Climate Change Commission's website.
That is correct.
Yeah. So that website is mde.maryland.gov/MCCC. That stands for Maryland Commission on Climate Change. So the slides and the webinar recording will be there. Christine and Peter, we got a couple of questions about public health impact of climate change and how we're responding to that. So maybe a question first for Peter. Could you give a little bit more detail on the STWG's recommendations surrounding understanding public health adaptation measures? So we know sort of what are the questions that we need to answer from a scientific perspective, and what are ways we can improve the understanding of public health impacts from climate change and viable adaptation pathways?
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and great question. So I think it's almost 5 years ago that Maryland did its last update of the climate impacts on human health. It was very broad reaching. And the question that was posed mentioned, did it look at things like asthma? Yes, it did. It looked at issues like salmonella and other examples. The suggestion is, and I believe that was conducted through CDC funding, a lot of those findings are actually available on the Climate Change Commission's webpage and presented in a very digestible way. So the recommendation is it's time to do another update of that between MDE and the Maryland Department of Health. And I'd also like to just call out, when you look at the details of recommendations, the efforts of Dr. Amir Sapkota, who's at the School of Public Policy at UMD, and Dr. Jane Kirshner, who's the Dean of Nursing at UMB, produce those details.
And Christine, there were questions about when we're there was a question about like when we're getting to boots on the ground implementation of adaptation and resilience projects. How do we coordinate with communities on that? I wonder if you could give us a flavor of, as we're implementing projects under the adaptation framework, what would that look like and how can communities participate in those projects?
Thanks, Chris. So there's a variety of different kinds of projects, obviously, that engage communities. And one way in which we solicit opportunities for communities is through the request for proposal process. So there are certainly quite a few opportunities for communities and local governments to come in and propose projects through our Grants Gateway grant program. However, we understand very keenly that there's also a huge capacity gap for communities to be able to respond and access those opportunities. So currently we're working with the Chesapeake Bay Trust. MDE is a partner in this also, to work with the trust and start developing community liaisons and tapping in to existing networks that work more closely with local governments and these underserved communities, to start bringing resources into communities that just might not be able to have the access to get to those resources. So that's an example of some of the efforts that we're taking on.
Thanks, Christine. Amy, we had a question about ECO's outreach activities for the year and the types of meetings that will be planned and suggestions for additional ones. Could you give us an idea of what ECO's thinking for the year and what sort of additional public engagement and education outreach efforts we could take on the Commission's behalf?
Sure thing. So the ECO Working Group is planning, we meet every other month. We are planning to host at least 4 public webinars next year, one for each of the current working groups, and to delve into their research and recommendations in more detail. We are also working on some education specific components in terms of awareness of climate change in the K through 12 and even undergraduate school curriculums. Those are our plans for next year.
Excellent. And we've received a couple of questions about in the alternative transportation realm, and this might be a question for Mike. Questions about maglev, about MARC rail extension, and sort of what can be done to provide more alternative transportation actions. I wonder if you could give us an idea of how the Commission approaches that issue and how we can best coordinate with sort of other state planning processes for specific transportation projects.
Yeah, we did not get into a discussion of maglev as particular, or indeed any particular route or method, but rather the category as a whole. The major focus has been on just the percentage of money that should be developed, that should be devoted to mass transit as opposed to highway, and recognition of the need to push additional transit-oriented development as a category. So we did not try to delve down into would maglev be good or bad, or where should it be, but instead that public transportation as a whole required more attention. I would add, just because it surprised me, we have not gotten as much benefit, if I can use that word, from COVID in terms of vehicle miles driven as I would have expected us to. And it just makes it even more important for us to figure out, is there any alternative way to get people out of their cars? But the golden lining at the center of that, because it's more than just a silver lining, is that if we get to 100% zero emission vehicles, then vehicle miles traveled becomes less important. If you're not producing any greenhouse gases from driving your car, then it's less crucial to get you out of the car and into a bus.
Thanks, Mike. We had one question asking for the link that I mentioned. Sorry if I said that too fast. You can see it on the screen in the lower right corner, mde.maryland.gov/MCCC. That's information from the commission, all of its working groups. We have a question about living shorelines and their role in resilience. And I wonder, Deputy Secretary Dorsey, and then Christine, you may have something to add. There's a question, what are we doing regarding living shorelines, oyster farming, kelp farming, et cetera, to protect the shoreline in Charles County in Southern Maryland?
Yeah, this is really a Christine question, but I want to thank Ms. Sims for this excellent question. Resiliency is very tightly connected with blue and green tools. Living shorelines are considered blue infrastructure, and they use nature-based solutions to solve one acute problem, shoreline erosion, but in doing so, they can support climate goals with carbon sequestration, and of course, also managing against storm damage. There are great programs at MDE for our permitting program, but I want to pass it to Christine because DNR really has global leaderships in this area. And even Dr. Goodwin could comment on it as well. But Christine, thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Yes, we do have a number of programs that can be utilized to help assist in this. We have a Living Shorelines program, which offers loans to communities to help protect shorelines. And then there are a variety of funding approaches for oysters and for SAV bed restoration. However, they need to be in the right place at the right time to do the work that we need them to do. So that's part of not only the challenge, but it's also part of the science and making sure that we are effectively deploying these resources where we get the living resource benefit and where we get the resilience benefit. I would encourage you to come to the next Green and Blue Infrastructure Commission meeting. We're just being held on January 4th. It is DNR Day, so we're going to be going through a number of the programs that we offer for both green and blue infrastructure, and we'll be diving into that intersection with resiliency a bit more. So time and place, type of project really matters. Thank you.
Thanks. And then there was one question that I think I might try to tackle about what we can do for composting facilities and reducing food waste finding its way to landfills. That's very important. I'll note, just keep an eye out, MDE's regulation on food waste diversion. I think due to be published in the Maryland Register tomorrow. So the state is taking action on that. And we're excited by that, and that'll complement the sort of methane regulation that I mentioned earlier for landfills to address methane that comes from what does find its way into landfills, while we try to reduce the amount of material that finds its way into landfills. We've had a couple of questions about the cost of transitions for households. And how are we going to ensure that households can sort of pay for things like converting to heat pumps? I wonder, Delegate Stein, if you'd be able to give us a flavor of the approach to that question in the Climate Solutions Now Act, and maybe more broadly, how we can ensure that households are given resources to do the things we know we need to do on a statewide basis.
Sure. I guess a few thoughts. First, the Climate Solutions Now Act didn't apply to homes. It just applied to large commercial or multifamily buildings. It in terms of so homes and new residential construction is not covered by the bill. However, we're aware of the fact that there are, for example, in perhaps multifamily unit dwellings where which are rental based, where a fair number of the tenants may have gas heat, there is a concern that over time their costs may go up. So we specifically did provide some funding to facilitate the conversion of those types of multifamily buildings to electric heat pumps. And lastly, I'll just say that in the Inflation Reduction Act, there are significant new incentives for electrification of your hot water system, your HVAC system. And so that will be large potential source of subsidies for the conversion to electric-based heating systems for households in Maryland and around the country.
Thanks so much, Delegate Stein. And I'm trying to be mindful of time. We are just about at closing, and there was a question that, since we're not going to get to all these questions, are there plans for a follow-up webinar? This is our second webinar of the year for the commission as a whole. All of the meetings, the working groups meet, some of them as frequently as monthly, and so there are always chances to engage there. I will say that MDE, we are happy to follow up with anyone individually to talk more about what is in the report, what the recommendations are, to supplement the times when we sort of get everybody together like this. So the door is open. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us with individual questions. We love talking about this stuff. We're happy to work with people individually to complement the upcoming meetings. But Amy, I see you come off mute. So yeah, anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, so we'll try to provide responses through email for the questions that we didn't get into, and some of them were very detailed. If you don't hear back from us within a few days, you can reach out via email to Susan Casey, who is kind of our warehouse of communications, and her email address is susan.casey1, so susan.casey1@maryland.gov. So if you have additional questions or questions that weren't answered and you haven't heard from us, please feel free to reach out to Susan, and she will coordinate responses. And with that, I want to thank everyone who participated, our speakers, all of our attendees, for the amazing questions that came in, so many. We thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And again, if you need additional information or you have additional questions, please reach out via Susan, and she will coordinate a response with you.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thanks so much, everyone.